Greetings. Once again, this is my first video for 2025, and this video is a little different than some of the ones I've done in the past, either for my classes or some of the antique equipment videos that I've done, like the last one I did. In this case, the genesis of this is in fact in my dynamics class at Lee University. But this is a topic of more general interest for people, because particularly those who either navigate in the water or in the air, or in the case of seaplanes, a little both. So with that in mind, I have invited my family cat to greet everyone as they come aboard for this voyage. I know I'm dealing with two different audiences at least for this, so I want to try to make this as generally applicable as possible. Our family was very big into yachts from the 1880s to the late 1960s. And our immediate family had 3 yachts, and the one pictured on the left is the second of those, which is the Don II, which was named after my brother and I, and which was in the family tradition to do that, also to do it that way. Well, we had this yacht, and it was slow, as you are going to see, but it was a very seaworthy yacht. And that was good, because the first voyage we took it to the Bahamas in July of 1965, it needed to be seaworthy for reasons that will become apparent, or at least resistant to accident. The need for that will become apparent as we go along. The first thing I'm going to put up is the basic course. Our first leg of the trip is between the Palm Beach Inlet, which separates Palm Beach and Singer Island, to West End, which is as the name implies, the very west end of Grand Bahama Island. It is a common port of entry to the Bahamas for Americans it's not the closest distance between the two. The closest actually is between Miami and Bimini, but it's fairly close. As you see, it's 56 nautical miles, and the navigation is fairly straightforward. If you're both engineers and yachtsmen and people who take to the sea and the air, to work with a fixed coordinate system, and you see that in your GPS. If you ever look for something, sometimes it will report the coordinates in longitude and latitude, and we have and without that, GPS wouldn't work. Well, this was back in the days before GPS, as you will see very shortly. And so, but in any event, in theory, the idea is we would leave the Palm Beach Inlet, we'd pass that buoy, which is marked on the chart, we would set a course of 94 degrees, and we would head to West End. End of story. And with a few variations, we could arrive there. Now, the problem with that is that we have fixed coordinate systems that the engineers like, and we have fixed coordinate systems that the seamen like. The problem is that the sea is not fixed. The sea moves, because between Palm Beach and West End, we have the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is one of the largest sea rivers we have on the earth, to use a simple term to describe it. And according to the charts of the time, it had about 2 knots. We're going to quote everything in this presentation in nautical miles and in knots, which is nautical miles per hour, rather than that to switch back between either statute miles, which is what we use in the US, or kilometers, which is what they use everywhere else. So with that in mind, the problem is, if you take this course, you will get an entirely different result. What would happen if you just ignored the effect of the Gulf Stream is you would end up with a course that looked like the one in red going across the chart, going from left to right. It would end up taking you far north, because basically what is happening as the engines in your boat pushes them forward, and again, this is the slow boat to the Bahamas, the cruising speed based on the logs which I have, or the transcriptions of the log which I have, about 9 knots. And it would end up you up in a little place south of what is called Memory Rock. And if you hit Memory Rock, it is something that it will justify the name of the place, because you won't forget it. And the people with you on the boat won't forget it. So why is that? Well, basically how we deal with that is, first of all, the course is a vector. And a vector is a quantity with both direction and magnitude. In this particular case, the original course has a velocity magnitude of 9 knots. And it has a direction magnitude of -4 degrees for the engineers, because the engineers' coordinate system points 0 is due east and it goes counterclockwise from that. Or the seamen have one which goes due north at 0 degrees and it goes clockwise, is positive. 94 degrees for the seamen, or -4 degrees for the engineers. So then you've got if the drift of the Gulf Stream is taken into account, you will get that red line, which actually takes you further north, as is shown on the chart. What we do in vector analysis is there's a third line. You'll see that red arrow pointing up from West End over on the right, or the starboard. Thank you, nautical people, for for reminding me of that. I actually do I have another video which I'll point to, and it's about buoyancy and stability of ships, which I did in my fluid mechanics lab. And I drove my students nuts with my nautical terminology, which kind of came second nature to me. And so with that out of the way, you've got that vector pointing upwards. And basically, if you add the original vector to that vector, you get the vector you're going to end up with, if you don't take into account the fact that your coordinate system of the Gulf Stream is moving. The water is moving. The ship is moving in with the Gulf Stream, in addition to wherever your slow engines, I think they were Detroit diesel 671s, I believe is what they were, are pushing at each one of the course you have. And if you don't take that into account, you'll end up in somewhere you don't want to be. And that is one of the challenges of navigating. And then that's for, something that many people are familiar with. If you take a canoe or a kayak and try to paddle across a river, and the river has a decent current to it, and actually all rivers by definition have some current to them, except maybe in exceptional circumstances, you're going to notice that if you don't do some kind of compensation for that, you're going to end up someplace you don't want to be. You're going to have further downstream in the case of a river, or in the case of the Gulf Stream further north, because the Gulf Stream in this particular point moves in round figures from south north. I'm assuming in this case that the Gulf Stream's movement is perpendicular to our course. And if you look at the chart, that's pretty close. So we have a problem. How do we fix that? So now we're going to show how we can compensate for that, at least to get started. Now we look at the chart with the corrected course. What I do is I eventually take the vector of the Gulf Stream and I reverse it 180 degrees. Instead of going 4 degrees north, it's now going 184 degrees south. And that's in Mariner's coordinates. And so what I do is I add that to the original one, and I get a new course, which is that green line that runs across. And so that's how you would compensate. In theory, the way to do it is you leave Palm Beach, and you set your autopilot, which we christened George, for that course. And in theory, what will happen is that as you cross, George doesn't know that the sea is moving under it, and basically what you'll end up, instead of a course looks like that, the two put together will give you sort of a curved course across the Gulf Stream, and you will end up at West End. Now, obviously, you've got problems. You know, first of all, the 2 knot speed of the Gulf Stream is a homogenizing assumption. It's going to vary as you cross, and so you're going to have to compensate for that. And basically, what you'll end up with in the real world, if you're really on your game, and particularly now you've got a situation where you've got your autopilots are now wired into GPS, and they're able to make compensations for assumptions that you made that weren't right, and they're able to basically take you across. Of course, if I were, one of the things you learn, you never let it completely trust a computer to do what it's supposed to do, and so you would keep an eye on it at least and make whatever changes we had. That's today, and you'll end up with sort of a curved course that's sort of like a bow with the bow itself, hanging off with, the Palm Beach on one end and West End on the other, and the bow hanging down. Is basically what you'd end up with, something like that. An overview of what would be happening now, but the question is, 60 years ago, how do we do this? Well, that's when things get complicated. And I'm going to I'm kind of getting away from the engineering aspects of it, and I'm going to try to reconstruct how my father actually got us from, who was the skipper of this ship, got us from Palm Beach Inlet to West End. And I'm basically showing a sort of a reconstruction. Like I said, I have the log. I have a transcription of the logs, so I've got an idea. The problem is the logs aren't very complete or informative. So I'm going to try to make a construction. One thing I want to bring in at this point is the fact that 30 years after this event, my brother was dying of pancreatic cancer. And he and I discussed many things. And one of those is my father's navigational skills. And my brother, who had been in the Coast Guard, had been to quartermaster school, basically said that my father's navigation left a lot to be desired of. And the more I look at the logs, the more I realize what my brother's talking about. And this one is a good example of it. The chart, as you see in blue, is sort of a semi-reconstruction, and I'll tell you how I did it. We left Palm Beach Inlet about 03:20 in the morning, and I'm going to superimpose briefly over there the tidal chart for Palm Beach Inlet. Basically, the tide was going out, and that picked us up maybe a couple of knots of current going out. And given the flow boat to the Bahamas, anything was helpful. Just as an aside, the current through an inlet is proportional to how much water has to either go in or out of Lake Worth, in this particular case, to the size of the inlet. And Palm Beach, 2 knots is not too bad. Down the coast at Boynton Inlet, that inlet can get pretty nasty because it's very narrow. For any of you who have been there or have been through it, and when the tide's running, it can be serious even for a boat with a lot more power for its size than the second Pimdon. So, in any event, we had that little advantage going in. We also had, we didn't get twilight for another 3 hours or so. The next log entry is at 0440, and it simply said change course. And this is a delightful because the log had nothing about where we were or how, or why they changed course or nothing. Just change course. I'm going to try to do a little forensic navigation on this and get to the bottom of how this happened. And to do that, I'm going to bring in my father's now again. Even though he spent a good part of World War II putting Loran stations up, we never had Loran on our ships the whole time we were there. And Loran is a navigational system that was fairly precise and was very useful before GPS took over. So, and of course, before that we had celestial navigation, and I don't think he was much on that either. And the weather reports indicate that we could have used celestial navigation if we could see the stars. So there's nothing there. What I'm about to do is to do but however, the one thing we did have on our boats was a direction finder. Back in the day, back 60 years ago, our government and other governments, like the Brits over in the Bahamas, it was still a British colony at the time, put up things called direction, and basically that is long wave. The long wave is the band which actually has lower frequencies than the AM band. AM band is considered medium wave, and this is long wave. They were down in the 300s or the 400s as opposed to, AM band which starts in the 500s. So we had that, and what these beacons would do is they would send out in Morse code their, the name or I think it's a 3-letter designation of the direction of them, and those locations were fixed. And you can actually see on the chart on the far left, we have the Palm Beach direction signal, and on the right you have the West End at Settlement Point. So what you would do is you'd have a radio to pick this up, and it would have an antenna on the top of it that you could be rotated either by hand, or sometimes some of the fancier ones I think may have had an automatic where it would home in on a signal. And you could find out the angle between, say, whatever coordinate system you were using on your ship, probably pointed 0 to the bow, and the direction finder, and back, back to the radio beacon. And then you would pick up another radio beacon, and then you could use triangulation to figure out where you were. And it was not the most exact thing, but it was easy to use, and it was pretty reliable. Long wave has very long, as the name, not only long wave, but also it travels well across, particularly the water. In fact, I'm not sure, I think they still do it. In the UK, you have long wave stations that basically cover the entire British Isles. So with that in mind, so what my guess is what he probably did, and it's probably a reasonable thing to do, would be to, he traveled until at 0440 he picked up the West End Settlement Point radio beacon. And basically what he did was aim the ship in that direction. Is probably the way he got there, and that's why he changed course. And the other interesting thing is that, and I'm basically guessing that he used the same math that we used, and that math is, I've got a link to that in the video notes. We use the math to actually get get from the Port of Palm Beach and compensate for the Gulf Stream, because actually the Gulf Stream is the fastest on the Florida side, not the Bahamas side. It actually peaks off of Palm Beach and then it goes down from there. I used a 2 average just to keep the problem simple. Well, he did that, and that's what I'm thinking. And then he's got this thing you see right after daylight. He sees 3 boats. which probably means, I mean, most boats are lit, I know that, but passing 3 ships, I mean, you know, those of you at Christmas, you know, we saw 3 ships on Christmas. Well, we saw them in the middle of the Straits of Florida, so in July. So there. That's the topsy-turvy world of boating. So in any event, we saw those 3 ships. I'm not sure why he even noted that. There's no location as usual. But in any event, we'd actually pulled into West End a little after 9 on that morning, and we achieved our objectives. West End is fairly visible somewhat visible from approaching the Bahamas. The name means the low islands, and one thing that is stuff doesn't really come up until the end. Let's just put it that way. It doesn't really come up until you're almost there, but it's there enough where we were able to. And of course, with that radio beacon, we could just home in on the radio beacon and just go into port. So that's my guess on how we actually did it. Now let's turn to the rest of the cruise. We, after a couple of days in West End, we left. And we left West End behind, as you can see in the video on the right. And we proceeded through the Abacos. The Abacos are a beautiful place, really, and they've been cruelly attacked by these hurricanes in the last few years. For those of us in the Church of God, it's important because the Abacos were one of the first places where our church's missionaries left the United States and planted churches. In fact, the oldest continued Church of God outside the United States is in Green Turtle Cay, which we actually was one of the places that we visited, if not very long, but we didn't know that at the time. We were Episcopalians raised at Bethesda and Palm Beach, and that was pretty much it for the moment. Although, I'll get to that. So we proceeded through the Abacos, the Marsh Harbor, and Hopetown, and places like that. And then we crossed to Eleuthera. Eleuthera, and specifically to the settlement of Spanish Wells. And this is where the moment of truth came. The moment of truth came as one of my father's more fateful decisions. Now, we've already discussed his navigational skills, and we now have to deal with wisdom in terms of more tight quarters. Spanish Wells has to the north of it I think it's the Great Egg Reef, and this is a coral reef, and they have, obviously, if you've got a bunch of coral rocks, some of which stick up very suddenly, you can suddenly find whatever boat you have. And the Pimdon 2 was, I think it drew about maybe 4 feet, something like that. It wasn't the deepest one. The one we had after that was deeper. But it wasn't the deepest one. But, you know, still in all, there were these coral protrusions. And my father made the executive decision that he was going to try to pick his way through the reef and get into Spanish Wells. Now, he had always told us how unreliable the charts are in the Bahamas. And you know, so why he made this, I'm not sure. The usual way that when you really don't know where you're going and you really want to make sure you get there is to hire a native guide. Now, by I say native guide, what I mean is someone who was born and raised in the area and who is familiar with all the little reefs and all the little channels and whatnot to safely navigate you from the open ocean to the harbor where you would be going. Well, my father decided he could do it. He figured this out. I'm not sure how he came to this conclusion, but it didn't work because we were picking. I mean, to his credit, we were going we were dead slow, and all of a sudden we heard this unsatisfying thud on the hull. We go below. The hull is not leaking. but we don't know what kind of damage it has or what may happen later. So my father gets on the horn, as we would call the Marine radio, and he gets a native guide to come out there and to basically guide the PIMDON 2 into the safety of Spanish Wells Harbor. Now, Spanish Wells had a small shipyard, and or boatyard really, and the PIMDON 2, even was a little over 50 feet long, was almost too big for it, but they said there's not much damage, you can go on. So we went on through Nassau and whatnot and came back to the United States. That was our trip to the Bahamas in the same year that they filmed Thunderball over there. In life, we have many uncertainties that we have to navigate our way through. Sometimes we are well informed about what's going on, but in many of the most important decisions we make, in many of the most important things that we do, we are not well informed. We don't understand all the contingent consequences that can come from our decisions. And so what we need, and that particularly applies to what happens to us after we cross the other side and go into eternity. We do not really, at this point, we have to realize that we don't really have the wherewithal or the knowledge or the power to really navigate that particular reef. But Jesus Christ, who came to earth, who lived here, who taught here, who suffered execution here, and who rose from the dead, knows how to get here, and he knows how to get back. And if you want to get across the reef of passing into eternal life, you will, and actually the nice thing about it is the services of Jesus Christ are free. You will have him. By following him, you will be able, and turning your life over to him, you will be able to navigate those reefs and and you will have benefits in this life, so that you will not have to do like we did and to either get repairs somewhere, or in many cases your life will go to the bottom. You will not make it across. I have a link up at the top which shows which gives you an outline on how to do that. And I encourage all of my viewers to consider how you plan to get across from ultimately death and uncertainty into eternal life. So I appreciate you watching this video today. I hope it is informative. I hope it may be a little bit inspiring, even though some of the events described there were not inspiring. But until then, thanks for watching, and God bless.